Hey everybody, welcome back. We have another Photoshop tutorial for you this week. Let's go ahead and get into our Photoshop tutorial. So on Canvas, under Files, you should find a .zip folder that's called B plus W images. That's black and white images. Go ahead and download that and unzip it if you have to, if you're on a PC. And you'll find these 6 images. One we're going to work through together. You'll need to post the one that we work through together, and you'll also have to do one yourself. And it doesn't have to be any of these 6 images. It can be something that you choose outside. Maybe you pull from the internet, or maybe you have a black and white photo that you'd like to colorize. Maybe it's a family photo or something like that. The only requirements are that it has to be of a relatively high resolution. So like if it's really low resolution, if you start to zoom in on your image and you really see those pixels, that's not going to be helpful at all. It's going to be pretty tough to colorize and make it look okay. The other requirement is that it has to have some human element in the shot. So like some kind of skin tone. If that's not like a human face, that's fine. If it has, maybe there's a hand in the shot or something that you'll have to colorize, that's good. You have to do skin tones in the color of skin tones. So if your idea was to make someone look like a Martian, or give them like purple skin for some reason, don't do that for this project. We want to see your ability to pull off skin tones, since that is probably the toughest part of colorizing photos, is just getting those skin tones right. Okay, so what we are going to do together is the shot of Georges Méliès. It's like a silent era filmmaker. So the portrait is not the best quality, right? There's a lot of old style photography quirks about it that we can use some of the tools in Photoshop to kind of clean up. So we know that there's a bunch of ways to get this into Photoshop, and maybe the regular way that we've done before is to create a canvas and then drag and drop or copy and paste a photo into the canvas. But I do want to show you this a bit of a quirk in Photoshop with black and white images. So another way to open an image in Photoshop is just to right click it, go to Open With, and then Adobe Photoshop 2020 or 2019 if that's what you're using. So I'll let the program load up real quick. All right, so now Méliès has loaded up into Photoshop. It looks completely normal. Now, if I were to want to add some kind of color to this image, which we will eventually do, so I'm just going to use my paintbrush real quick just to show you what's going to happen. Paintbrush, and I'm going to make it red, and then I'm going to start painting. But I don't paint red, right? I paint some form of gray. And that's because the color space that was chosen was grayscale. Because our image is all in grayscale, Photoshop just kind of assumed that that's what we would be working in. And because we want to colorize this stuff, we want to add color to a grayscale image, we would need to change that. So the easy way to do that is to go to Image at the top of the program, Mode, and then we would change that to whatever makes sense. In this case, we're going to post our stuff up on Canvas. So RGB color is good for internet purposes. If we were going to print this thing out, CMYK would be the way to go. All right, so now we're in RGB color. If I paint red, it comes out red. So step 1 is done. All right, so now if I kind of zoom in on my photo here, I can see some of the quirks that I have issues with. I see all of these little like black specks through the foreground. It's probably on the actual film. We can also see these like scratches and hairs that aren't like part of his mustache or beard, but I could probably clean that up a little bit too. What I really want to clean up is the things that might be a little bit distracting, but leave any kind of quirks that wouldn't be distracting at all. So There's like all this film grain. We probably want to just leave that alone rather than try to make this look like a super modern photo. And then maybe some of those little dots that are actually in his beard we would leave alone, since we can't tell if that's like stubble or if that's something in the film. Like something like this is definitely not stubble. That's actually something with the film, and something right by it. There's a little bit of an issue right next to his eye here as well. So there's two kind of categories for photo cleanup tools, and that is destructive tools and non-destructive tools. So essentially non-destructive tools you can erase without messing up your photo, and destructive tools are kind of burned into the layer that your photo actually exists on. So if you use those destructive tools and then you don't immediately press Control Z like you've messed something up, Control Z will always undo, remember, and you decide like 15 steps later you do a bunch of stuff with your photo that you want to take away that destructive cleanup that you did. You're going to either undo all of the stuff that all 15 of those steps to get rid of that thing, or you just won't be able to get rid of it in general. So destructive, less helpful than non-destructive. Non-destructive we would put all on their own layer, so we could just simply erase the non-destructive elements, and then we would be back to where we were with the original photo. So let's go ahead and work with non-destructive cleanup first, and then we can do some destructive stuff, and if that interferes with our non-destructive items, we can redo that pretty quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new layer, and I'm going to rename this layer non-destructive cleanup. Now, there may be a chance that you do a whole lot of non-destructive cleanups, and maybe you take a single pass and then do another pass on a separate layer, and that's totally fine to do. It really depends on what your image is, but chances are I'm only going to use one tool for any given cleanup area. So like if I'm taking out this spot, I'm probably not going to use 3 tools on it. I'm just going to use 1. If I happen to use 2 tools in a single area, that's the point where I would want to create a second non-destructive cleanup layer. And I could label them so that I would remember what is on which layer. So like if I use a clone stamp on one layer, I might call this one non-destructive cleanup clone stamp. If I use the spot healing brush on a different one, I would label it as such, so I can keep everything organized and know what's going on each layer. Okay, so the easiest thing that we can use is this spot healing brush. It's J on your keyboard. If you click and hold, you'll find that there's a bunch of tools that you can use to clean up your photography. The red eye tool certainly isn't going to help us with black and white images, but you know, like if you've seen those old school flash photos where people get red eyes and look like demons, if you needed to clean that up, there's a tool for that. You just simply use the tool and paint on around the eyes, and that red should disappear. Okay, the content aware move tool and patch tool, these are destructive tools, so we won't look at those yet. Instead, we just want to look at these two, spot healing brush and healing brush tool. So let's start with the spot healing brush, and that's probably the easiest tool to work with for some non-destructive edits. If we look along the top here, it has options just like our brush. Okay, so you have hardness and size options and brush angle, all that fun stuff. You can also use the same like brush shortcuts. So if you use open bracket and close bracket, you can see that the brush size changes there. Under type here, under mode here, we can see that there are blending modes for this. So if what you want to do is not completely demolish this dot, you want it to be there but less prominent, you can use a blending mode, and we'll get into blending modes today for sure, but we won't touch on that just yet with this project since we want these things to go away entirely. Okay, so here's how the tool works. If you simply find an area that you want to disappear, you click it and it goes away. You can also click and hold and paint with the tool, and it will do the same thing. So what's actually going on here is you have some options with it too. Up here at the top where it says type, you can use content aware, create a texture, or use a proximity match. And the ones that you'll probably use are either content aware or proximity match, and chances are 99% of the time you'll use content aware. And it basically looks at the pixels around where you've painted and then pastes those pixels in the area that you've painted. So content aware will use some Photoshop AI to make sure that it's not grabbing some things that it thinks wouldn't be a part of that. So if I'm looking at some area around Melié's head, chances are if I click right here, it's not going to paint with his face, but it's actually going to paint with areas of this background, because it'll say, hey, I can see a hard edge on this face here, and maybe I don't want to paint with something that's clearly more distinct. Okay, now where it may run into some trouble is if you look at Melié's like forehead to background here, there's not a ton of difference, right? Like we can perceive this this outline around his head, but can the computer tell that there's an outline there? It looks very, very similar pixel to pixel. So if I paint right here, I actually did an okay job, but if I look very closely, you can see in this area right here that it's pulled a few pixels from the forehead. And honestly, it's kind of hard for us to tell because those pixels are so close. So maybe people wouldn't notice that, but I certainly do. And you might notice it as well. So do look out for some stuff like that. In that case, we might switch to the proximity match, and it's just going to look directly around the pixels of the paintbrush. So either of these are pretty good options for you. The create texture could potentially work, but if you look here, you can see that the texture doesn't quite match the background, since the background isn't like a uniform texture throughout. So for the purposes of this project, it's probably not going to help you. It could maybe come in handy at some point if you're working with something that's a very clear, distinct texture. Now, if you try using your spot healing brush and you find that it's not really doing anything, make sure that a couple of things are selected. One, we want to make sure that we are on this non-destructive cleanup layer, so we aren't doing destructive work, even though it's a non-destructive tool. If we're on that background layer, we are then messing with the background layer. We want it on its own layer for sure. And then if it just does nothing when you've selected that non-destructive cleanup layer, that's probably because this sample all layers checkmark box is not toggled on. So if you have this toggled off, then it's only sampling from the non-destructive cleanup layer, and if there's nothing in there, it can't sample any pixels, right? So you're painting with the pixels from all layers if you sample all layers. All right, so let's go ahead and use the spot healing brush to kind of clean up everything that we can. If you find that the spot healing brush doesn't work in a specific area, just Control Z that, and we'll use a different tool to clean that stuff up. I'm working with a mouse today instead of the trackpad, so a couple of good shortcuts for you when you're working on this stuff. Chances are you're going to want to zoom in and out pretty quickly, so if you hold in, if your mouse happens to have a scroll wheel, if you hold in Alt, you can zoom in and out quickly. And if you want to move up and down after you've zoomed in, it's just the scroll wheel up and down to move up and down. Likewise, if you want to move right and left, if you hold in Control on your keyboard, now your mouse wheel will move you left and right. Okay, so I've cleaned up a little bit on his face and the background and his suit, but I run into a few issues when I get to this area right along the side of his face. So if I use that spot healing brush, now I'm starting to paint with either a few pixels of his face or eat into portions of his face. If I do this with the hair that's not a part of his beard, then it ends up sampling another piece of the hair. So something that we can use to kind of correct for that is just the regular healing brush. If you click and hold, the healing brush is maybe less easy to use, certainly not as quick as the spot healing brush, but it is a little bit more precise in which pixels we use to paint with. So once I select the regular healing brush on, again, it's got all of the attributes of a regular brush. So if we want to turn that up or down using the brackets, we can. Now, what's different about the healing brush versus the spot healing brush is you don't have that content aware fill thing happening. Instead, what you have to do is define the pixels that you're going to use. So if you hold an Alt on your keyboard, you'll see that your mouse cursor turns into a crosshairs. So if I hold an Alt and then I click, that's the point at which I'm going to start to paint. So it's a little bit harder to put into words than to actually show you. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to click and hold, and you can see a crosshairs where I defined that start point, and then my mouse cursor is actually on that hair. That's a bit of an issue. And you can see as I start painting that the crosshairs moves with my paintbrush, but in a relative way. So I'm painting with the pixels that were in that first layer. So I can do that multiple times. If I switch to a different area, maybe up by his eye now, I can click some pixels that are fairly close in terms of proximity to the area that I want to paint, and I can just paint that out. And I can do that again for this hair that's up here. Now this tool is very, very similar to the clone stamp tool. So the clone stamp could do essentially the same exact thing. You hold an Alt to define a target area, and then you click to paint with that target area. There are some other things that the clone stamp can do a little bit better than the healing brush. The healing brush is intended to correct for things. The clone stamp can do that, but it can also like copy and paste portions of your photo elsewhere. And just to demonstrate what the clone stamp can do, I'm going to hold an Alt, and I'm going to grab this area next to, or I'm going to grab the pixels that are this button here. So hold an Alt and click, and now I could paste this button somewhere else on my image quickly and easily without having to do a whole lot of extra work. That looks a little bit silly though, so I'm just going to Control Z that. If you wanted to use the clone stamp, like you're familiar with that instead of the healing brush, the same exact workflow would work for you. So same tool or different tool, same buttons, Alt and click to define an area, and then just click to paint in that area. So there are some other non-destructive cleanup options for you. There is the content-aware fill and content-aware move that exist. It's not super helpful for this particular project, and I assure you that we will cover it when we get into composites, and we'll even use it in some of our After Effects work in the future. So don't think I'm leaving this out completely if you have worked in Photoshop before. Okay, so let's deal with some of these destructive items. So if I head back to my background layer, and I'm just going to turn off the lock on the layer, and that'll go from a background layer into layer 0. And maybe I could just rename that to original image just to keep things organized. Okay, so we have a ton of destructive cleanup items. I'll show you one really quickly that I certainly wouldn't use, but it is an option for you. So if I create a selection on my image, and I'm just doing a very, very quick one. It's not super clean around him. We would have to do some more extensive work, and we're going to get into these selection tools here in a minute. I can then head on over to the Filter tab into noise, and then dust and scratches. So this was a much older, less refined option for maybe cleaning up some grain or some noise issues with old film stuff. So I have my selection made, and if I turn up my radius, you'll see that that will kind of blur out, but it doesn't really blur the same way a normal blur or blur tool would work. Um, it it takes the areas of high contrast and blurs those. So how it defines those areas of high contrast, if it's like this speck here, well, let's just zoom in on this speck, and that'll give us a better idea of how this works. So right now it's blurring basically everything because our threshold is at 0. But as I turn up the threshold, it says, hey, look for more contrasty areas to affect. So now as I turn up that radius, you see that it's only really affecting the areas in that black speck, since that's a high area of contrast. If I zoom out, you can see it's really not messing with anything else, just messing with that area. Now as I turn down my threshold, you'll see that it starts to eat into the rest of my background. So it depends on what your grain looks like, what your settings would be for this. But the idea here is threshold, adjust the area of contrast that you're affecting, and radius is basically the power of the filter over the image. I'm just going to press cancel on that because I certainly don't want to use it, and I don't want to just like dismantle the grain that exists here. Now, if I did want to maybe blur this background just a little bit to make Mr. Méliès pop a little bit more, I can do that. And I can do that with an actual tool. So if I look over on the left edge, right now mine is set for smudge tool, but I think the preset is blur. So it should look like a little like drop of water or a drop of paint there, and that's the blur tool. If you happen to have like a triangle or the finger there, that's one of the alternate options underneath it. So if I select the blur tool, actually, it has those same options for brush settings. So again, I can use my brackets to turn that up or down. And then you'll find blending modes again, but also strength. So I can turn up the strength. I could set this as a non-destructive cleanup as well by sampling all layers. And why not? So let's just switch back over to that non-destructive cleanup. Even though we're looking at mostly destructive items now, I could just blur this background a little bit. And then if I had issues, I could always just get rid of that blur. So the higher the strength and the more I run over the same area, the more blur there will be. So if I just kind of like zoom in, you can see my blur actually taking effect now. And little goes a long way with this stuff, and blur maybe takes a few passes to get exactly where you want it to be. So even at 100% strength, it's not doing too much to really manipulate my image more than I want. So if it happened to be, you could always turn down the strength just a little bit. But that looks pretty good to me. It didn't do too much. It didn't take away the grain that was there, but it helps him kind of pop off the background a little bit more. Now, when we actually get into color and stuff, that's probably going to be a more dramatic effect than what we have. But this helps a little bit. Now you can see in my layers now, since I worked with a large area of the background, if you look very closely at the thumbnail there, you can see that you can see parts of the thumbnail like painted in because we've done enough cleanup that we can actually see it in that small of a thumbnail. Now if I just shy out my my original image layer, I can see exactly what's going on here. So I can see all of my non-destructive cleanups that I've made, and then I can see my blur area that I've worked on. And maybe I got my blur a little bit too far into his head here. So that's what really helps with having this on its own separate layer and a non-destructive cleanup. If it was on that original layer and I blurred in this area, I would have to press Control Z until it went away. In this case, I could just use my eraser tool, and again, that works just like a brush. And maybe I want it to be a little softer. Definitely. So a nice large soft brush, I can just clean up that area of blur that I didn't want to be there. So while we're looking at the blur tool, there's also the sharpen tool and the smudge tool, and it might help just to know what these things are since we already covered the blur tool. The sharpen tool sharpens a portion of your image. Again, we can do this non-destructively. We can sample all layers. And then maybe I just want to sharpen his eyes out a little bit so they pop a little bit more. And you can see what actually happens here. It sharpens the pixels. So let me just keep doing it over and over again so you can really see what happens when I sharpen things too much. And I would say that this photo is not a very good candidate for using some sharpening tools because there's all of these like film quirks in here. You see all those like lines of, I don't know, print lines, I guess they are. It really emphasizes those print lines, so you can tell pretty quickly that this is being manipulated digitally. So I wouldn't touch this thing unless you do it super duper subtly. So maybe we could turn the strength down to like 25% and take 1 or 2 passes at it. And if I zoom out, does it look artificial? Yeah, it still does. So I'm going to undo it, and I'm just going to turn off the old one and make sure that I've undone enough. Okay, so at this point I have undone enough. It was a little bit confusing for me how many times I'd actually clicked. And if you end up in that position, there's this helpful tool. So for example, if I clicked and used that sharpen tool over and over again, and I clicked and drop and click and drop a few times, I don't know how many times to actually undo to get there. I could just like erase that area since it's on that layer. But if it was a destructive item, I wouldn't have that option. And maybe it's just easier for you to do this anyway. If you click on this little button here in the top right-ish area, it looks like maybe like an undo arrow with three boxes next to it. If we click on it, we can see everything that we've done in terms of actions in the program. So we can see that I used the sharpen tool 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And I can actually just jump back in terms of actions too. So I can just click on layer visibility. That's where we were before. So it undid all of those sharpen things as soon as I do a new action. So if I sharpen again, now all of that stuff is gone except for my new sharpen action. So I can click on layer visibility again, and that sharpen went away. So if you end up needing to undo several times and you're not sure how many times specifically, you can use this history button here, and that can really save the day, especially when you get into these destructive edits. One more thing under the blur tool is the smudge tool, and it's going to be something that probably isn't helpful for this project or a whole lot of other projects, but maybe for some like illustrations or something kind of creative. You basically just smudge your paint. So imagine that this whole thing is wet paint, and then you wanted to smudge it around. You do that with the smudge tool. There's a strength option there, so if we wanted to make him more of a cartoon, we could certainly do that with the smudge tool. There's also like the liquefy tool if you find that working with faces with the smudge tool is something that you really enjoy. We will touch on the liquefy tool in a later tutorial. So right underneath the blur, sharpen, and smudge tools are the burn and dodge tools. And if you've ever been in like a actual film photography class, these probably aren't new items for you. So the burn tool makes things darker. The dodge tool makes things lighter. And then there's one under there too called the sponge tool, and that sponges out some of the saturation in your image, which isn't really helpful for us now since there's no color. So saturation is basically like the intensity of a color in your image. But it does help to have burn and dodge. So we have this whole area in the bottom corners where everything's a little bit too bright. So we can use the burn tool. So we want to darken these areas. And how strong you have this thing, how strong you use this tool is adjusted by this exposure control in the control bar up here. So if you want it to be darker quicker, you can turn this number up. If you find that it's too dark too fast, you can turn the number down. Also, what it affects is this range here. So if you want to turn down the highlights of the image, you select highlights initially. If you want to adjust the midtones, and then shadows, you select shadows. For this, I think we should start in the highlights since it is one of the brightest areas of our image. It's very, very bright. So we'll start in the highlights. We'll have our exposure turned down so it's not too drastic of an adjustment initially. And what we want to do is not really make this completely normal since there's no details in there. You know, it's so bright that you're losing the details. You're not going to be able to like bring back details that weren't there initially. So we don't want to bring this down completely, or we'll really be able to tell that those details don't exist. But we can bring it down a little bit so it's not so distracting. So highlights adjusted a little bit, and then I might go into my midtones and bring those down a little bit too. And at this point, I would call that pretty good. So again, those finer details just aren't going to come back there, but we can kind of bring the brightness down to an area that's not quite so bright and distracting in our image. We could also potentially just crop that area out, but we want to retain as much of this image as we can. So another destructive item, and one that I probably wouldn't use too often either, the patch tool. If we go back under where the spot healing brush was, you'll find a thing that looks like a patch, and that is the patch tool. So if you need to correct a very large item, so maybe something like this, and we wanted to patch this with pixels from nearby, you can just draw a selection around the area that you want to change, and then click and drag, and you'll find that that selection kind of moves, and that's your target selection. So if you want to paint this area with this selection, it's as simple as that. But there are much more like refined tools to kind of make this sort of thing happen. So maybe you can use the patch tool if you're maybe in a hurry and you need to target a very large area very quickly. Otherwise, I would kind of stay away from it. There's the content aware fill. Again, we'll cover that later. If you need to fill in a very large area with content from the original image. So I just noticed real quickly that I maybe missed an area up in this top corner, so I'm going to clean that up real quick. Now, something you may have noticed as you did a destructive edit towards the bottom of the frame, if you had some of these scratches, I just kind of missed them in my initial first pass with the spot healing brush. And as you darkened this area, you might have noticed that your non-destructive cleanups didn't translate very well. It got darker, but your non-destructive ones like didn't get darker, so you really see your work there. And that's a good time to go back into this layer, just erase the area that doesn't look so great, and then redo it really quickly. So that spot healing brush, you certainly noticed just how quick it works. So once you have everything kind of cleaned up in terms of exposure and stuff, you might have to redo a couple of things. But it's really easy to redo those things since it's on its own layer and can be erased very simply and easily. All right, so at this point, Melier's looking pretty good, except he's in black and white. So we want to clean him up, and so we want to bring him into the modern world. So let's get started on that. I'm going to head on over to the right side of my screen, and where it currently says Learn here, you see an option for adjustments. These are adjustment layers. So they're pretty similar to the layers that we currently have, except they make an adjustment to all of the layers underneath it. So let's see what that looks like in action. If I just add what's called hue and saturation, by the way, if you just hover over any of these, you can see in the text above it what it actually is. If you hover over hue and saturation for a second, click it, you'll see that there is a new adjustment layer, and it looks a little bit different than our regular layers. There's this thumbnail that's off to the right side, and then a little icon that tells you what kind of layer it is. So even though the text says hue saturation 1, we could rename this to anything we want. So if we wanted to rename this to background, as though we are going to change the color, the hue, right, of this background area, we can know what it's referring to. And then that icon tells us what kind of adjustment layer it is. And if you can't remember what does this icon do, you can just go back to these adjustment layers and hover over until you find, hey, this is the icon. If I hover over this icon, it says hue and saturation. Likewise, if I click on it under the properties window, pull out here, you can see that, hey, that's hue and saturation. It says it right here. Okay, so initially, to colorize any area of this image, I'm just going to click colorize, and now we have some color in our black and white image, and then we can adjust the hue, the color of it, the saturation, the intensity of the color of it, and then the lightness of that color. So it's up to you what you want to use for a background color, but maybe I'll just choose this kind of teal, and I'll adjust the color as well. And don't worry about anything other than the background right now. What we're adjusting is the background. All of this other stuff is incidental. Okay, so I'm happy with this color for just this area, but now how do I make sure that it's only affecting this area? Well, that's what this little thumbnail is. All of the areas of white are being affected by this hue and saturation. Now, if we painted in black on this layer, then it wouldn't affect any areas of black. So if we just grab our paintbrush tool and select black for our color for our paintbrush, and we start painting, probably need a much larger brush, you'll see that we're just painting out the color that exists. So we could go quickly initially with a large brush, and then we can kind of touch up the corners with a smaller brush and take things a little bit slower. Now when you get to his mustache here, you might find yourself in a little bit of trouble as you start to paint this black. You'll see that, man, you have these really harsh edges. Even if you soften up your brush pretty good, it looks a little bit funky, right? And that's probably because his brush would be semi-transparent. And we can clean that up just using the opacity here on our brush. So we can take several passes at it until we get just what we want. That looks a little bit better. All right, so our background looks all right here, but before we move on, we should probably take a quick gander at what we actually have black and white. We can see it in our thumbnail here, which is helpful, but that thumbnail is really small, right? So if we hold an Alt on our keyboard and then click that thumbnail, we can see what we've actually painted here. So we can see our all of our brush strokes, if we have them. We can see if we maybe missed some areas. Like down here, I missed in the corner, so I can clean that up pretty quickly and easily just by using a very large brush and black. Just paint that in really quickly. So now I won't have any remnants of teal in my image. And maybe there's some areas around his neck here. It looks like that's a little bit unnatural, that little concave area. And if I jump back, I can see, yes, I actually did miss an area on his neck there. All right, so that is one way to work, is just adjustment layers and then the paintbrush tool and bounce back and forth and stuff. So if you don't want to use brushes, you can also use selection tools to make these things work. So let's get into the super fun selection tools. So we already know about the rectangular marquee tool, and just by proxy, you should know what the elliptical marquee tool does. So elliptical marquee can select out ovals or circles. If you hold in shift, you can get a nice round circle. It's completely round and stuff. Same goes with the marquee tool. If you want it to be a perfect square, hold in shift and that'll do that for you. Underneath that, though, you'll find the lasso tool. And this is kind of the basis for a lot of the tools in Photoshop. So if you click and drag and draw, you can actually draw a selection. And the lasso tool is incredibly difficult to work with if you're trying to do something precise. Like, I'm going fairly quickly here, but you can see all of my issues with the mouse right now, that I've left out all of this stuff. But where the lasso tool actually really helps is it's very fast, right? So if you work with something much more precise, but you have a few flaws there, the lasso tool can really help you. Let me just jump in here. It can really help you refine your selection pretty quickly. So if I want to remove something from my selection, all I have to do is press Alt on my keyboard, and you'll see if you look very, very closely, your mouse cursor has the lasso next to it, but also a minus. So that means you're removing things from your selection. So I can grab something really quickly and pull it from my selection. Likewise, if I want to add something, maybe I missed part of his mustache here, hold in Shift, and then you can add to your selection. The lasso tool probably isn't the best option for you if you're trying to do something from scratch, but it really does come in handy if you're just trying to refine your selection for a few things that you may have missed really quickly, or a few things that you need to add really quickly. So if you need to deselect everything, if you've made a selection that you're not proud of, you can do that. There is a shortcut for that. If you just press Control D, then you have deselected things. So lasso tool, fast but pretty imprecise. There are polygonal lasso tools and magnetic lasso tools that are a little bit more precise. It uses some of Photoshop's AI to help you out there. Polygonal is if you click, you get points. So click and move and click and move, and you'll draw a rough polygon. So if you happen to need to select out something that's very angular, this could potentially come in handy for you. Probably not great for something more organic like a face. And once you create your shape, press Enter on your keyboard, it will turn it into a selection, and then you can manipulate it from there. So possible to use this, certainly. For faces, probably not so great. Control Z or Control D on your keyboard will deselect or undo that. The magnetic lasso tool is much, much more precise. Once you click with the magnetic lasso tool, you don't stop until your selection is completed. So if I click once and start dragging, you can see all of these points are created, not by me clicking, but just by where the computer thinks some points should go. So it's looking for areas of contrast. So around this hair, it's doing a really great job. But as soon as I get to this ear, it's going to have some problems, right? Because that ear is so bright compared to the background that is also bright. So it can't find that contrast easily. It wants to go to the inner part of the ear that has that dark color in there. So if I want to help this along a little bit, I can just click and that will manually create a few dots. And if it does happen to go off track a little bit, you can press backspace on your keyboard and it will undo some of those single points. So once again, at like the forehead, it's having some pretty significant issues. Our forehead is very close to our background again. So just like the polygonal lasso tool, enter on your keyboard will complete your selection, and you'll get these nice zebra lines that say this is what is within your selection. So the polygonal lasso tool could work for you with this project if you spend a little bit of time with it. I'm going to head down one option on our toolbar to the object selection tool. So this is new in Photoshop. Let's see how it works on Melier's head here. We'll just click it, we'll drag a rectangle around the area, and it's going to do its best to select out the object within that area. And it does a pretty darn good job of it. So this is Photoshop's AI at work, looking for those areas of contrast all around your image, and maybe this is the perfect starting point. It's missing a little bit of the mustache, it's missing a little bit of the ear, but it's done a really fine job assuming where the line is with the forehead. So great job there, and maybe you just use the lasso tool to grab these extra areas, or the magnetic lasso tool, or whichever tool of your choosing you want. If we click and hold, we'll also see a couple of other options that are similar using Photoshop's AI. If I just press Control D, I can use the quick selection tool. You start painting within the subject that you want to select, and you might have to come a little bit closer to the edges to get exactly what you want. And just like most of the other tools that we've learned in Photoshop, it works just like a brush. We can turn up the brush size if we need to. There is also a select and deselect option. So if we end up grabbing, maybe we didn't want his neck here, we can turn the deselect on. Alt on your keyboard is going to, again, deselect for us. And that is another strong option using Photoshop's AI to select an area. Again, we might have to come through with the lasso tool or another tool to grab these very refined areas of the mustache and stuff. We'd zoom way in to get that just right. And maybe around his ear as well, since I see a little bit of white next to his ear. Okay, one further down is the magic wand tool. Once again, I'm going to deselect, Control D there. The magic wand tool will sample a series of pixels around the click point. So if we click his forehead, it's going to sample all of the pixels around his forehead. So it's going to grab, you can see right away that, like, hey, his nose and forehead are very similar in terms of pixels, and it really helps when you have this kind of outline around that. The problem, though, is that parts of the background are very similar as well, so we have some issues there. So if you want to sample things that are much closer in terms of pixel range, we can turn the tolerance down to maybe 10%. And now if we click on the forehead, it's just getting the forehead. It's also, it's missing the nose and those bits of background too. So if we want to use this several times, we can hold in Shift and we can add to our selection using the magic wand tool over and over again. So one more selection tool, and it is the most precise selection tool that you have, but also probably the most time consuming. So that's the pen tool. So if, right underneath burn and dodge, you find a thing that looks like a pen top. P on your keyboard for pen. And you'll find that the pen tool does a lot of things. You can create shapes, but you can also make selections with it. So if I use the pen tool, there's a few quirks about it. Let me go ahead and zoom in real quick for you. So let's say we wanted to select out the eye. Now the eye would be really tough, even using Photoshop's AI stuff. Just seeing like how dark these pixels are. AI is going to have some trouble defining this as a clear line in the eye, right? But we can presume that that line does exist because we have brains. Now, to use the pen tool, all you have to do is click and then move to your next point and click again, and you'll get a straight line. Now, if you click and hold, you'll create Beziers, which are curved lines, and you can drag out that Bezier handle. These two handles here are not a part of the selection that you're creating with the pen. It's just this first blue line. So it might take a little while to get used to, but click again, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. You can see those Bezier handles disappearing as you move on to your next point. When you complete your path, you can then turn your path into a selection, but you don't complete your path until you connect your last point to your first point. So make sure that that completes entirely. You'll see all of these little squares turn into solid blue squares at that point. But now we can head up to our control bar here and click Make a Selection, and then tell it how many pixels you want to feather the edge. So that's again something like a soft brush, right? It's feathered out on the edge. It softens the edge a little bit. So I'll just do 2 pixels, something very, very unfeathered, but still has a little bit of something. It's not like hard pixeled edge. Okay, now we've created our selection, and it is exactly our eye. So if I tried to do the same thing with one of the other like AI selection tools, let's just try the object selection tool since it did so well for us earlier. If I do that, it's grabbing all sorts of parts of the eye that I don't want because those areas of contrast aren't super defined. Okay, so at this point, you should feel like you have a tool of choice, and it's totally up to you which tools you want to use. I use the pen tool generally if it's like a paid project and I get paid well enough to spend the time on it. But if it's not, if it's something I'm trying to do quickly, I'll probably start with one of Photoshop's AI tools and then refine from there, since it's much, much quicker to do. So I'm just going to click and drag using that object tool. I did a pretty good job last time. Maybe I want to pick up parts of his neck though. So I can do that using any of the other tools. Rather than use the lasso tool, I'm just going to use the quick selection tool and press Shift on my keyboard so it adds to my selection. So I'm going to look pretty closely at the outside edge. I see that parts of his neck didn't get grabbed here. And if I use that quick select tool again, it ends up grabbing parts of his collar, and it may look like that's a little bit frustrating initially, but remember Alt on our keyboard will deselect areas. And so long as we've selected the area we want to keep, Photoshop's AI really refines itself as we take more and more passes at it. So I'm going to go around and get a clean selection on Melié's entire face now. All right, we could make this a little bit nicer with the pen tool, or even using the lasso tool here and there. But this looks pretty good, especially just for the internet. And I'm fairly happy with my selection. Now, before I do anything crazy with it, I'm just going to shy out all layers except for my original layer. I'm going to head up to the control bar here, and where it says select and mask, I'm going to click on that really quickly. So as soon as I click that, I can see what my selection actually is, and I can kind of refine things within the select and mask options. So over on properties here, we have some options to adjust the transparency initially if you want to see what it looks like in comparison to the background. If yours is set at 0, you won't see your selection very well. I like to keep mine up near 100 at least, so I can really see what my selection looks like. Now, Radius uses some of Photoshop's AI to kind of clean up edges. So you see how kind of rough my edge is here. If I start to turn up the radius, you'll see that it does its best to kind of stipple out that edge to make it look a little bit nicer. Now, if we want to clean some things up beyond just the properties area, we do have some options with brushes to paint in or paint things out, to refine edges. All of that stuff is available to us. We also have the lasso tool and the object selection tool inside the select and mask area. So what I could do is maybe turn up my radius. I still see a remnant of that hair that we didn't want there. I can just use my lasso tool to deselect it. So just hold in Alt and drag a selection around it, and now it's gone. Under these global refinements here, we can smooth out our selection too, so that stippled edge could get a little bit smoother, a little bit more. It looks feathered, but we actually have a feather down here if we want to feather that edge a little bit further. Contrast would essentially do the inverse of feathering. It hardens the edge a little bit. And then shift edge, if we've done some feathering work and part of our subject has, we've lost a little bit of our subject from the feather, we can shift the edge in the opposite direction, in the positive direction, and we'd gain a little bit more of our subject. Likewise, if we ended up getting a little bit too much of our background, we can shift the edge in the opposite direction and cut out some of that background. So if I zoom out, most of my selection looks good. It looks like I may have messed up a few areas around the head, and if I maybe pop in at his ear looks okay, but his forehead looks kind of messed up. So I'll go back through and kind of refine that a little bit. At this point, I'd say pretty happy with that selection. When you feel like your selection is absolutely perfect, you press OK, and it's just going to give you that same kind of outline that we had before. Maybe there's a little bit to kind of clean up with his ears still. I'm going to go ahead and do that really quickly. And maybe there's some areas that you didn't notice in the select and mask. I didn't notice that I was losing a little bit of his ear here. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that up even more. I'm going to use the lasso tool just to be fast about things. And if you do add things to your selection after the select and mask, you can always jump back into the select and mask and refine things further if you want, or double check things. If you're happy with everything though, go ahead and press OK there. And your selection is now complete. So how do we apply this selection to an adjustment layer? Well, it's as simple as having the selection made and then clicking an adjustment layer option. So again, we're using the hue and saturation. Click it, and now you'll see right away that just that white area is our selection. So everything that we do is only going to affect our initial selection. I'm going to move that up to the top here, and I'm going to rename it and make sure it says head. we're going to attempt to get skin tones proper on this face. So we'll just colorize it like we did before, and then try to find a good color for skin tones. So saturation is really important with skin tones. The more saturated it is, the less realistic it looks. We can toggle back on that background to see what things look like. And remember, because these are adjustment layers and only affecting the areas around it, if we go back to that background and say, hey, that doesn't look so great now because of what the skin tones look like and stuff, maybe I want to change the color, maybe I want to adjust the saturation controls, that's always an option. That's always an option for us. So this is how we're going to work. We are going to work through the entire image layer by layer. We'll do his suit, we'll do his tie, we'll do his hair, we'll do his eyes all separately. And we can use either paintbrushes or selection tools or potentially both, right? So if we look at this head real quick and alt click it, we can see what we have as a selection, and then maybe we want to refine this actually with a paintbrush. So if we look at his mustache here, remember that should be somewhat transparent. Right now it has a feathered edge on it, but maybe we want a little bit more transparency to it. So we can use our brush, we can use black, and then maybe smaller and less opacity. So just a little bit to it, so that mustache isn't quite as strong. Now we could do a little bit more with the head. There's obviously like some skin tones in his eyeballs here, and if we just use the mask that we've created here, if we alt click, we can see the actual mask again. Alt click again, go back to normal. If we wanted to paint out his eyes, we can just use the paintbrush now, and black paintbrush, opacity 100. And maybe a soft edge and kind of paint this area out. And then we might want to fill in the area later with some eye color or something like that. Now, once you get to this hair and stuff that's on his head, you probably want to blend that with the actual skin tone. So we can do that as a separate layer and then use an actual blending mode. So let's go ahead and do it your choice of methods. If you want to use the paintbrush, if you want to use a selection tool. When it comes to hair, I like a paintbrush just a little bit more, but it's totally up to you. We're going to do it the same exact way we did before, though. If we're using the paintbrush, we're going to add a hue and saturation layer, since we want to keep all of the hair white and it's a smaller area. We could paint out everything black around it, or you know what we could do? We could use a paint bucket tool, paint the entirety black, then we can use a paintbrush, turn it white, and use that to paint in the areas that we want to be affected by the hue and saturation filter. So once again, I'm going to colorize this filter. It's doing nothing right now because everything is black. Use my white paintbrush, make sure I'm on the thumbnail for hue and saturation, that layer here, and then I can paint out his beard maybe, and we'll just call this beard real quick. And right now we're painting it red. No worries if it's a color that you don't prefer, because we can always change that after the fact. We're using that hue and saturation. And also no worries if you have a semi-hard edge that you don't like. So like at his mustache right now out here, it looks pretty darn rough. But I'm going to show you a method to clean that up a little bit. Likewise, if you hit some areas that have like some stubble and stuff and you're not really sure how much to paint in these areas, make sure that they are, at least painted with the edge of a soft brush. But we'll clean that up a lot more with blending mode. But stuff like this, you could probably still stand to turn the opacity pretty far down, since it's just barely supposed to tint the face in this area. So we'll make sure all that stuff is cleaned up. We won't have any like super hard edges on the actual face. If we do, we can always kind of touch that up with maybe another brush or an eraser, your choice of tools again. All right, so that's probably not the color of his beard. We can adjust that now if we wanted to make it. If we wanted to make him like a black-haired person, maybe we go into the blues actually and desaturate that pretty significantly. So there's still a little bit of color there. It's just mostly black. So already that looks a little bit better. These edges though are pretty rough still. And what we can do to kind of clean that up is use a blending mode. So I promised you would learn these blending modes, and you'll get to know them a lot better as we do more complex projects and stuff. But there are a few that could help us here. So there's a drop down right next to opacity. You could use opacity controls too, but let's give these blending modes a shot. And if you click that drop down and just hover over, you can see what any of these blending modes actually do. There's a lighten blending mode that could come in handy here. There's an overlay, which just overlays the color on top of the other layer. There's soft light that looks pretty good as well. So feel free to experiment and look at what looks best to you. What I would say is lighten could work. Also overlay, soft light could work as well. And you see those edges just kind of disappear, right? Like they look much less bold. What I might use is lighten, since I think that looks a little bit nicer. So very subtle work there. If I toggle it off and on, I can see, hey, it does shift from that skin tone look to, I can still see skin tone underneath it, but the hair is a different color. And from here, I can also add in the rest of his head hair. So I can turn off the blending mode temporarily to see my edges a little bit clearer before I turn on that blending mode. And you know already that your edges are going to look okay after adding the blending mode, so you can be a little bit less precise about things. But again, you do want to cover all of the hair entirely. You don't want to miss any spots. So there's this little bit of hair that goes from his head into his beard, and we'll make sure we cover that. Maybe with a lower opacity brush too. Okay, now we can switch back on our choice of blending modes, and now his hair looks significantly nicer. Okay, beard and hair look good, but there's still some hair on his face. We have these eyebrows, so continuing the same adjustments. All right, much better. So on the head, beyond just, the hairs that we have created and stuff, if we want to clean up a little bit of the shadow areas, so like in his ear and in his nose here, we probably don't want to see quite so much skin tone there, since that's a little bit weird. A little bit of skin tone's okay, but too much of it and it looks artificial. So we'll go back into our head layer. If we alt click it, we can see exactly what's going on here. We have our eyes painted out entirely. Maybe there's certainly going to be some refinement going on there. But these areas here, if we just use our paintbrush black, turn the opacity down, we can kind of paint some of this stuff out slowly over time. You'll see the skin tone kind of come out of it. And you might need to turn the opacity down more or less depending on if you're using a blending mode or something on the skin tone, which you could use. If your head skin tone looks too bold here, you could potentially use a blending mode here as well. So like maybe a soft light or an overlay makes more sense for your skin tones. I just happen to feel like the skin tone looked pretty good for me, so I'm going to leave it. All right, so if we zoom out, we see that we're making progress now. Our hair looks good. Our skin tone looks pretty good. If we needed to clean some things up, we could still do that. But we need to paint in his suit, his tie, his shirt potentially too, if you wanted a color to his shirt, and then his eyes as well. So at this point, you should have all the tools necessary to complete this on your own and to use your own sort of workflow. So let's do that before you get into your bigger project where you have to tackle it as a whole conceptually and decide which tools to use. So at this point, I've worked through all of the major elements. I've got his eyes colored and his skin tones, his suit, his tie, his hair, all that stuff. Oh, the background as well. I could go through and kind of refine each of these elements since it's a little too bold in terms of saturation overall. Or what I could do is I could add a hue and saturation with no mask, and with no mask it's going to affect the entirety of my image so long as it's the uppermost layer. By the way, you should consider that as you put this thing together as well. I have my background as the lowest layer, then the suit, then the tie, then the head, then the beard, then the eyes. Also, like, if there is any kind of overlap between your masks, the precedent goes to the thing that is closest to the foreground. Okay, so since my hue and saturation has no mask on it, it's going to affect everything underneath it. If you wanted it to just affect one area, you can always click this little icon right here. It looks like a rectangle with an arrow with a strike through on the arrow. That means that the adjustment layer will only affect the layer directly underneath it, none of the other layers. But since we want to do kind of an overall sort of thing, hue and saturation, we can go here and then just like desaturate the image a little bit. So that takes away some of those like neon colors and the skin tones here and just gives us a kind of faint colorization of our overall image. And I'm pretty happy with that. I would say that that's a good black and white to original. If I wanted to just see what the original looked like, I can shy out those layers and bang, that's what it looked like before. And with it all on, that's what it looked like after. I would say that that is a fairly successful colorized photo. If yours looks a little bit too bold in terms of colors, consider adding that overall hue and saturation at the end and turning that down. If it looks bold in specific areas, go into those areas and adjust that hue and saturation. It does take some time to get used to what looks good and what doesn't look good in terms of these adjustments. It takes years upon years to make things look natural, especially when it comes to skin tones. That's why we're practicing. So upload your Georges Méliès colorized photo as well as your choice of black and white photos. You have 2 to do this week. I know that this is a fairly complicated project. We should have something a little bit easier next week. But take your time with this one. Try to make it look good. It could be portfolio worthy if you choose a good photo and do a good job. So good luck with this project. Reach out to me if you need help, and I will see you all next week with even more Photoshop.